Good morning, Frank. An interesting week, an intriguing week. Actually, how often do we get this number of significant people who always make the headlines actually interacting with each other and agreeing and disagreeing about things that we weren't expecting? Starting off with the NATO meeting and finishing with the President of the United States and the Queen of England.
Mm-hmm.
And it makes one think about the way the world has been organized as a global community before we ever started to talk about globalization, and the way people are competing, or countries are competing with each other now, about how they should be represented in relation to each other. And I mean, it's amusing to me to see that the way England is internally organized is pretty much the same as it was under Queen Victoria, and well, even though of course the way it relates to other countries is completely changed, but we still have the same sort of way of thinking about different levels of government as we had in the 19th century,
Mm-hmm.
even though they certainly don't work in the same way, but they do work. But that made me think, well, really, we are still in the aftermath of the age of empires. So starting as early as the second or even the third millennium BCE, when writing began to be used as an aid to administration, and cities became city-states, and then city-states became empires, and we had the Babylonian Empire and then the Persian Empire and so on. And we finished up with the European empires in the last few centuries, and especially the British Empire was probably the largest at the beginning of the 20th century. And then, of course, everything began to change with the two world wars, and Europe had to completely reorganize itself, even though the age of nation states had somewhat changed the age of empires in the last couple of centuries. And so France and Germany, that had to completely redevelop themselves after the Second World War, were doing it in terms of the idea of nation states. And since America had been outside it all and was obviously more powerful than everybody else, it became the hegemonic nation in the world, and was really operating very similarly in relation to other parts of the world as the British Empire had in the 19th century.
Mm-hmm.
So now we have a president who thinks that who doesn't think of it in those terms, but thinks of it in much more in terms of bilateral relations, and whether each country is contributing the same amount to the relationship. And that's not the way it developed at all. The whole idea in the 1950s and 1960s was that America was helping all the other countries. Now, and of course now we've got the European Union and Brexit, and just exactly whether London can become the financial center of the world outside the European Union again or not. All these old ideas are still influencing the way people think as they try to work out what the relationships are going to be between the main political players in a globalized world.
Well, I think you've touched on a key point, and that is that the post-World War II institutions, whether it be NATO, whether it be the American hegemony, whether it be the United Nations, these institutions were formed in response to World War II and to some extent World War One and the inadequate peace treaty that was imposed after World War One. And I think there was a thrust or an interest to ensure that war never broke out again in Europe at that level, and then B, some sort of protective, cooperative effort was installed against the Soviet Union threat. And what seems to have happened is over time, as the prospect of a European land war amongst Europeans has receded, and as the Soviet Union ended and no longer was the Soviet Union, I think that people have forgotten why those institutions were formed in the first place, as you noted. And what's happening is that perhaps Trump is not so much as an anomaly as perhaps I had thought, in that what he represents is, and I don't mean this in a particularly negative manner, but what he represents is a bit of ignorance as to why these institutions exist in the first place. And even if he was informed, would most likely wave his hand away at it, saying that's all very old stuff, 50, 60, 70 years old. What matters is what can they do for us today? And that's a valid line of argument. People understand that. That's the populist kind of argument that we spoke about last week. But there are people who are playing a far longer game here. For example, the Chinese are, I think the Russians are, and I'm reminded about what Zhou Enlai told Henry Kissinger when they first met in Beijing back in 1972, when they were discussing the French Revolution, and Zhou Enlai told Kissinger it was too soon to tell what the effects of the French Revolution were. And that's what the dichotomy is here. There are people playing a short, transaction-oriented game, and Trump is not the only one. And then there are people who are recognizing, well, wait a minute. I mean, take a look around the cemeteries in Europe at the tens of thousands of American soldiers buried here, who have come here on 2 occasions to fight. I mean, this is not necessarily a threat that you can just make go away.
They're not historically oriented, and they're also not thinking far enough into the future about the way things are changing. And this has always been a problem, and it's something we've talked about on and off before, that change is something that we don't really understand, and it's not properly studied. But meanwhile, the Chinese are now starting from their part of the world and working westwards, very much the same sort of thing as the Americans were doing after the Second World War, working eastwards. Mm-hmm. So that countries like Pakistan and even possibly Iran, it's beginning to happen in Iran, are coming under China's hegemony in the same way that Iran came under American hegemony in the 1960s. And of course, now the big powers in the world are America, Europe, Russia, and China. There's no competition from anywhere in Africa so far. But none of these four that are really in competition with each other and are squabbling a little bit on their borders because they have borders of influence, don't understand the historical background of what's going on. So, I mean, it's natural that Russia should be interested in Ukraine and the Crimea in the way it is or has been, simply because these were part of the Russian Empire and had been that for a long time.
Right, right.
I mean, we have similar things going on in the British Isles in a way, on a much smaller scale, because for such a long time, Scotland, Wales, and Ireland were run from London, and nobody questioned the idea. And then it started to be questioned around 100 years ago, a little bit more than that, I suppose, in Ireland. And now it's being questioned more and more. So what I had in mind was that we should be focusing on this week is the question of just exactly how's this going to develop, because are we going to finish up with a globalized world of four major powers and four political sectors: China, Russia, Europe, and America? Because America seems to be quarreling with Europe at the moment, and makes it look as though it's going to be separate politically from Europe, or are things going to break up again? Because I've always thought that a truly globalized world is going to have to be much more interactive on a lower level than that. That it won't work. It's going to be like the book 1984. Or even the Brave New World.
Yeah. To your point, I think that trying to close that barn door, I think right now it's too late. That horse is long gone. Okay.
Oh.
I mean, globalization is happening at a lower level, and I think that what's going on right now, what we see with Trump, what we see with I think to some extent what the Chinese are trying to impose, I think a lot of that is happening at the top. That's top-down kind of a process that we talk about all the time. There truly is, I think, as a result of the communication and socialization tools that are available now, there's a bottom-up process that's going on now that can look, for example, at what happened last weekend with the rescue of those boys from that cave in Thailand. That was in one of the most remote places on Earth. Okay, look what happened. I mean, there were 1,000 journalists there. There was live 24-hour TV coverage. The New York Times, the Washington Post, and the Wall Street Journal have had extensive 2- and 3-page articles describing in detail how the rescue came about. I mean,
and divers from every part of the world.
And divers from every part of the world. It's as if this happened in our own backyard. Right? The level of concern and interest that was shown by people around the world. And I mean, I went to church on Sunday, and the priest was talking about it. I mean, it's
really,
and this wouldn't be happening, as we know, but for the processes of the intensified globalization that have been going on for the past 50 or 60 years. So I think that what Trump and what others might be trying to do at a top-down level, I think, will they have an effect on some things? Yeah, some things will slow down. But for example, if you look at economics, those cars that are made in the United States that are then shipped partially built over to Mexico and then have additive components put in and then sent back across the border for more components, then sent back across the border for more components, then sent back again. I mean, that's not going to stop. It's not going to stop. I think the process is inevitable.
All these new tariffs are just another feature of the same process, and I think can't last so very long. But it's all part of the competition between the larger powers who want to be recognized for what they think they are, instead of simply working towards a future that they've thought about carefully.
I agree with you, and I think you said the key point right there when you said I don't think the tariffs are going to last very long, and you're exactly right, because the constituencies of those people who are being affected, whether they be soybean farmers, aluminum producers, people who produce nails in the United States, I'm just thinking of examples I've read in the paper, have a voice
Yeah.
now. They have a voice. They're able to be heard.
Yeah.
I mean, you and I are talking about them. We know about it. So that kind of capability was not possible 50 years ago. People would write letters to their congressmen. I mean, nothing would ever happen. Now things are happening. So deals are being made, exceptions are being made, and there's going to be a backing down. I'm sure they'll have to be, because the economic harm is going to be such that the complaints will be too loud.
I'm glad you brought in that issue of the changing political mechanics of the process that produced Brexit and produced the current American administration unexpectedly. And very similar things are going on in different parts of the world, that ordinary people are much more globally aware and paying much more attention of things outside their own community, and playing a much more serious role in the political process. And that's all part of this larger global process that's taking over.
And I think in the end, I would respectfully submit to you, is the best reason for your long professed optimism, in that the people as a whole, whoever they may be, they seem to understand it. They will not be put back into that barn and be denied that kind of contact, whether it be cultural or economic or social, with people in other cultures and other countries. That can't happen. That genie's out of the bottle.
So we're going to finish up being able to say "we the people" again.
Well, it is Bastille Day in France, after all. Although I don't think they said "we the people" there. They said "on y va." So, okay, all right. Thank you very much, Professor Spooner.
See you next week.
Bye bye.